Okay, hello there everyone. My name is Alex Wendland, and today I'll be giving a talk on the medical applications of virtual reality. So thank you for showing up. Let me get screen sharing going here. Okay, so this talk will be about the medical applications of virtual reality. My name is Alex Wendland. I am currently acting as the CTO at a startup called Luminopia. A little bit more background on me. I am a Harvard College student. I have experience in the software development industry, about 4 or 5 years or so. I worked as a lead software engineer at a company called FireEye, which did malware network security. Following that, I was a lead full stack developer at a mobile application company called AMP Element. And now I am currently acting as the CTO at a virtual reality healthcare startup called Luminopia. So some background on Luminopia, because it's directly applicable to this, and I'll be using it as a case study for much of my talk. It was founded just last September in 2015. And our goal at Luminopia is to use virtual reality to treat ocular disorders, eye disorders, and we'll be beginning with amblyopia, which is colloquially known as lazy eye. We're our current stage of our company. We've developed several prototypes, and we are preparing to start 2 clinical trials, one at the Boston Children's Hospital and the other at the Southern School of Optometry. We have a scientific board of advisors composed of 8 members, and they're made up of some of the nation's leading ophthalmologists, optometrists, vision therapists, and amblyopia researchers. They all have an interest in how we can progress the treatment of eye disorders using virtual reality. So a quick overview on what is and why is this talk necessary. I'm going to start with the what. Throughout this talk, I'm going to try answering 2 questions. The first being, how can VR be used to treat medical disorders? And the second being, how can a startup economically and efficiently approach VR? And my perspective on these questions is from that of someone in a virtual reality healthcare startup that's a couple months old and is completing their funding round. So I'll be trying to share some from the trenches experience with you on that regard. So to frame my talk, I wanted to give a quick overview of the current applications of virtual reality, which I think a lot of the prior speakers have done so, but I'm going to give my take on it and how it relates to how medical applications later on. So VR in its current form is mostly applied to luxury entertainment, and in particular to gaming and video media. So here's a quick screen cap of when you Google VR between January and February, that's the type of news that pops up. It's mostly related to gaming and video. So I'm going to start with talking about virtual reality gaming. So VR gaming is stealing all the headlines, basically. It's predicted by Grandview Research to be a $10 billion market by 2022. And at the Game Development Conference just a little bit ago, there were dozens of new gaming titles released for VR, and those titles represent millions of dollars in development being applied to the VR gaming space. And additionally, to top it all off, Oculus was sold a couple years ago to Facebook for $2 billion prior to having a consumer-ready product. So just a quick overview of the current VR options at the high end of the spectrum. These are all very nice VR options. They cost in excess of $400 pretty much, and they provide a pretty good VR experience, but they're expensive and not always accessible to a lot of people. In addition to cost, there's some more VR gaming difficulties. So gaming is actually one of the hardest applications for virtual reality for a couple of reasons. The main one is there's rapid movement both of the user and of the NPCs in a game. The rapid movement of the user can cause nausea, though this is getting better with recent technology. But the rapid movement also leads to issues such as requiring very high-spec hardware in order to make the game work and look seamless in the virtual reality environment. Because VR, being it's supposed to represent reality, you have to have pretty intense rendering of the game to make it work. Additionally, one of the biggest unsolved problems of VR gaming is the problem of lateral movement. So how is a player supposed to move around inside the game? The HTC Vive tries to attempt it with the camera setup, but it's still a difficult problem that people are working on. One of the huge benefits, though, of VR gaming is that it is really pushing the technology forward faster than any other facet. Secondly, another big focus of VR is on video media, which is a new frontier for cinematography. You're seeing a lot of cinematographers get quite interested in it. At Sundance 2016 and last year as well, this year there were over 30 VR-related movie experiences. So VR video is definitely gaining popularity, but it does beg the question, how similar is it to 3D TVs? So 3D TVs back in 2009 were predicted to occupy 86% of the market by 2014. Unfortunately, if you look at current day stats, a lot of companies have phased out their 3D TV offerings because consumers didn't find value in them. So one of the big issues that VR is facing is, what does it bring to the table that's valuable more so than just being luxury entertainment? So luxury entertainment is good for driving technology forward, but is only a small aspect of the greater impact that VR technology can have on all facets of life. So it's a fun usage of VR, but how can VR really actually impact someone's life for the better? And so that's where I attempt to answer the first question, and I want to present to you that VR can be applied to medical treatment to be a revolutionary approach to treatment methods that have never been done before and that bring a VR to something useful in day-to-day life. So I'll be working on a case study through this talk of kind of VR as applied to eye or ocular treatment, because that is what the startup I'm working at is currently working on and running clinical studies with. So one of the most awesome things about virtual reality is that you totally control a person's visual stimulus. And because you control their visual stimulus, you basically control all of their environment, because most of our environment is derived from visual stimulus. So with that control, you're able to create stimulus inputs for a user and perception inputs for a user that were difficult, if not impossible, prior to virtual reality. So in a simple sense, virtual reality could be used to fix mechanically based ocular disorders such as strabismus, which is when a user has cross eyes. So what the virtual reality setup could do is it could have the screen set up aligned to the person's cross-eyed view, but over time slowly move them in an attempt to realign their eyes so that they then have a permanent realignment of where their eyes are properly aligned. And this is currently undergoing clinical trials right now. It's looking pretty promising. Hopefully those results will be released in the coming months. Additionally, and potentially most excitingly, VR can take advantage of neuroplasticity. So many ocular disorders are actually not mechanical issues, but instead are based neurologically. And those include amblyopia, as well as dyslexia and many others. And because VR can fully control the visual input to the brain, it can therefore be used to manipulate perception in a way that promotes treatment for neurological disorders. So a specific case study I'll be focusing on is amblyopia, colloquially known as lazy eye. Amblyopia, and now I'm going to be quoting here to give you some background on what amblyopia is. This is from a prominent study done. Amblyopia is a developmental disorder which results from the physiological alterations in the visual cortex early in life. What that means is that one of the eyes during the development of the visual cortex was blocked from receiving full visual stimulus, and because of that, the brain did not develop strong neural connections to take input from that eye. And therefore, the person was left permanently with poor vision in that eye. So amblyopia is considered the most prominent and most frequent vision issue outside of mechanical issues. It affects, now this stat says 1 to 4, it's a little outdated. New statistics say about 3 to 5% of the population worldwide, and that's most likely underdiagnosed because many countries don't diagnose for it as effectively as the US and don't treat it as effectively as the US. So what's the current treatment of amblyopia? So I can compare it to how virtual reality can very much change this space. So the current treatment requires that children wear eye patches for about 18 months for 2 hours per day. And to explain a stat that I will be comparing against in the next slide, about 120 hours of wearing an eye patch results in a single line of visual acuity improvement. And I'll come back to that. But one of the more important things about eye patching is that it doesn't work at all in people over 13 years of age. And in a lot of people, it doesn't even work if they're over 8 years of age. So there's a very strict cutoff for eye patching because it's not a very effective treatment. So something very exciting going on right now is the application of virtual reality and similar input or visual stimulus control mechanisms for improving amblyopia. These are two prominent studies that I'd like to focus on, conducted at UC Berkeley and conducted by Dr. Stager. And what the first one uses a video game as a treatment for amblyopia compared to eye patching. And what they do is that adults will, which is very important because current treatments don't work in adults. So about 50 adults were split into two groups. One group played a game that was set up with a treatment that changed the visual input to each eye, and the others watched a movie while wearing an eye patch. And what they found is that the group that played the game, using the virtual reality-like setup, improved 2 to 3 bars on the visual acuity scale in just 40 hours. Now, contrast that to the 120 hours it took to improve 1 bar with eye patching, and you're looking at something that's about potentially 6 to 9 times faster, which is very exciting. And more importantly, it lasted over a long period of time without treatment as well. So it seems to be a permanent fix. A second one is the binocular iPad treatment for amblyopia in preschool kids. So this one had preschool kids play one of 2 versions of an iPad game. One version was applying the treatment was changing the visual stimulus to the strong eye in order to promote the usage of both eyes, while the other setup was not. Now, this treatment method used red-blue or red-green glasses to change the visual stimulus to each eye. So it was not full VR. Now, it's important that I do mention how I'm using VR in this talk. When I say VR, I may not mean exactly what some of the prior speakers meant as virtual reality. Instead, I'm talking about looser sense of virtual reality, as virtual reality applies to the control of visual stimulus, because so much of our input in our environmental perception is based off of vision. The control of visual stimulus is very much, in a sense, virtual reality. So, and in this study, they also found an improvement in about a fourth of the time required for normal eye patching. So how does virtual reality help with this treatment? How does it work? So these methods of treatment are based off of an idea that by selectively occluding or reducing input to the stronger eye, you're forcing the weaker eye to work harder and therefore strengthening the neural connections. So the brain takes full input from the weaker eye. In a virtual reality development sense, this is obtained by either reducing the contrast of the screen providing input to the stronger eye, or you can do a less intrusive method that is a little bit more GPU intensive that does blurring, a selective blurring to the stronger eye's image, requiring you to use input from the weaker eye in order to see what's actually there. So some important concerns that have been raised around using virtual reality treatment for eye treatment and other types of treatment. These are the 3 big ones we have found doing our consumer research. The first one is long-term usage of LED, LCD, and similar screens up close to someone's face damaging? And so the clinical trials that I mentioned before, like all clinical trials, have to go through a scientific review board. And so these trials were approved. The approval does require extensive safety precautions. So they were approved because it's been found that there are basically no negative long-term side effects of using a screen for this long, for this close. And then also another thing, especially when you're considering children's use of VR, is how are accommodations made for the various widths in people's eyes? as in the distance between them. And so VR headsets in the very cheap range, the Google Cardboards below $30, usually don't have accommodations for that. But once you get into more expensive methods, they have lens adjustments so that you can slide them side to side to make sure that you are seeing, so that they're lined up perfectly with your pupils so that you see the best VR experience possible. Thirdly is, how are people who need glasses accommodated by VR? So this one is actually a little more difficult. Very few headsets accommodate glasses directly. But fortunately for people wearing glasses, is that most people, when they use VR, actually don't need glasses because the VR lenses have an infinite focal length, which results in a lack of need for glasses or a lack of need for the correction that glasses usually apply. So for most people, it should not be an issue. So that was an attempt to foray into how can VR be used to treat medical disorders. I'm now going to begin to approach how can a startup economically and efficiently use VR and implement VR, and share our experience from Luminopia on how we are approaching that. So, and in addition to that, so I'm going to talk a bit about the considerations and specifically the medical application of VR, and then I'll a little more broadly talk about the other concerns that healthcare startups need to address. So these are the 5 biggest issues and concerns that basically any healthcare VR company or any healthcare company in general needs to approach. The first one being cost. You want to keep costs low for both you to produce the product as well as for your consumers to buy the product. You need the product to be easy to use. This is especially true for VR, which can be quite complex for people, and if poorly implemented, can be almost impossible to use for people. So ease of use is very critical in any VR application. Another important thing, because VR is quite young, you need to educate your consumer base about it. They don't always know how to use it, so it's very important that you provide thorough education on the product. And more general, for a healthcare startup, it's very important that you prove the effectiveness of your product. Like any medical treatment or any treatment in general, you need to prove that your product works. So I'll quickly talk about that. And then 5th and last is analytics. For basically any startup, it's very critical to get analytic data on how your consumers are using your product, because that allows you to iterate faster on the product and also to improve features that your customers most want. So the first thing is cost. And so one of the biggest things about cost is that medical, especially with medical treatments, is that you want them to be accessible to as many people as possible. And if you price the product too high, you've now cut out most of the world because they simply won't be able to afford it. So you'll limit your market size to just the US, Canada, and Western Europe mostly. But if you price the product too low, you're now missing out on potential revenue from targeting Western Europe and North America. So what one thing that we found is the best solution is to create a range of products that target developing nations as well as developed nations, that provide economic-specific features that allow the products to be differentiated but still be accessible to people in all regions, which massively expands the market size. So how to keep costs low, and how are we keeping costs low? So we're trying to target a range of devices, all from the very bottom Google Cardboard $5 headsets all the way up to the HTC Vive. And this is getting easier as time goes on. There's new SDKs coming out with multi-platform support. The Google Cardboard SDK is pretty good and covers basically all Google Cardboard devices, which range quite a bit. And then there's also Steam VR, which provides multi-platform support for quite a few headsets. So that's nice for development. Another important feature is iterating frequently during development. So unlike games, they need to be released basically like in a final state that's perfect. VR, you don't always have to treat like games, even though it's very similar to games. You can treat it like normal apps, which means you can release versions that maybe aren't perfect, but you can receive feedback on those, and then you can iterate and do frequent updates. And then another important thing for cost is use the simplest technologies to build your prototypes. It's great to try learning new technologies and jumping into new things, but that's going to hurt you cost-wise, and it's best to use familiar and simple technologies for building an MVP. And I'll provide a quick example of that from our experience at Luminopia. So we had to develop a demo minimum viable product back at our start in September in order to come to advisors to show how our treatment worked, and also to come to investors to show what we were developing more extensive prototypes around. And for this initial demo, we didn't want to waste extensive resources on it. We just wanted to get it done with. And thanks to new simple technologies, we were able to do it pretty well. So we built our first VR demo on basically just the web platform. So it was accessible on almost every device. We leveraged a couple new features. We are using high-performance WebGL and Canvas rendering to keep the game running smoothly. We're using the on-device orientation, which is a device API that gives you gyroscope access on a website to the device's gyroscope, basically, so you're able to mimic a full-on native application in that respect. And then there's also CSS3 has GPU-based transforms, so you could even easily apply various filters and things without having to write any special GPU code. So our demo was a basic cube runner game, which I'll show a screenshot of in the next slide. And it was very simple. It was just cube runner. And the main goal was to demonstrate our treatment method and do so in a Google Cardboard setup. So we had support for the players to move their head around, to move through the cubes, and we had our treatment being applied live to the game. So it ran on all Google Cardboard devices, and thanks to the nice state of the web platform currently, we were able to do it in less than 1,000 lines of code, and it took pretty much less than 10 hours to write the entire thing. So here's a basic screenshot. This is a very simple early version. I wish I could show a more recent prototype, but we're trying to keep those under wraps right now. So what's going on here is we are applying contrast to the left image, which is not being applied to the right image. So the left image is supposed to be the left image is supposed to be the stronger eye. And now, if you looked at this through Google Cardboard, you wouldn't notice that there were any differences. But what it's doing to someone who's amblyopic, who has a weak right eye, is it's forcing them to use their right eye. Otherwise, if they were to continue forward and they couldn't use their right eye, they would hit the block because they didn't see it in the stronger eye. So the game forces them to use both eyes. So a second important design consideration is ease of use. Because VR presents a whole new environment for stimulating a user, you really have to make sure that it's easy for the user to interact with and understand the environment. What we've found is there's three very important design considerations concerning ease of use. The first one is head tracking. If the app doesn't properly track the user's head as they move around, it causes the user quite a bit of discomfort. It's a little jarring, and it also can make them a little nauseous. So it's important that you have good head tracking, which new SDKs cover quite well. So you usually don't have to implement that yourself. Another important feature we found for cross-platform support is hover to click. So many cheap VR devices, and just many VR devices in general, don't have a mechanical click functionality. So what you need to implement for a full cross-platform app is where, if you're in your VR environment, if you look at an object that is clickable, if you don't have a mechanical click button, instead you can look at the object, and maybe after 2 seconds of looking at that would signify that you clicked on the object. A third important feature is the ability to return to the home screen or navigate around in the app. So VR in its current state is very restricting to users because their users are the virtual reality doesn't have the full degrees of freedom as normal reality, of course. And so users are not used to being restrained in that way. So what we found is it's very important for the user to quickly be able to jump out of the environment, out of the game, into the home screen of the application easily. And what we found is you can either place maybe a hover to click setup if they look straight down or if they look straight up, or if they look straight up, maybe for 2 seconds, it will jump them back to the home screen. The third, and one of the most critical once you release a consumer product for VR is education. So VR is such a new technology. People don't have an innate understanding of how it works yet. It hasn't been subsumed into public common sense yet. And so this is very similar to how smartphones and even like original telephones a couple centuries ago, how they were so novel when they first came out, but after given enough time and with proper education, people understood them quite well. So VR is not to that point yet. So it's very important that when you're building a VR application that you implement education. And what we found is that it's very important to implement education in two forms. The first form being that you provide context outside of the VR environment, preparing the user for how the VR environment is going to be and how they're going to interact with it so that they're not jolted or discomforted when they enter the environment. And then also to provide them with walkthrough tutorials inside the VR environment that train them how to use it. And the walkthrough tutorials are extremely critical. You should not slap them on last because users, if they don't understand how to use your VR application, then they won't use your VR application. It's a very novel thing for them. So you have to train them very explicitly how to use it. So education can get quite a bit simpler if you follow standard practices in the VR space. Doesn't mean you don't have to still educate them, because if your application is the first time they're using VR, then it's important that you educate them. But if you follow standard practices, it's quite nice for the user because then they can transfer their knowledge of how VR works between various devices. But don't feel constrained that you only have to follow standard practices, because if there's a feature that isn't standard, but you need it for your VR application, then feel free to implement. Just make sure to educate users about it. So the fourth important thing for a healthcare startup is proof of effectiveness. And there are two ways you can prove effectiveness. One of them much more rigorous much more rigorous and official than the other. That would be clinical trials. So like all medical devices, a VR treatment for eye or for any other type of medical treatment requires rigorous proof that it actually works. Otherwise, it has to be sold as a therapy or a supplement. So what are clinical trials? Just to get that out of the way. Clinical trials are controlled studies or controlled experiments that have been approved by a scientific review board. So the scientific review board makes sure that they follow both rigorous scientific and ethical standards prior to being conducted. And how are they different from just an observational study? In an observational study, data is passively collected and then analyzed for correlation, while in a clinical trial, a specific treatment is applied to one group but not another, and then the resulting symptoms are compared and analyzed to find how the treatment actually affected the participants. Another important method for proving effectiveness and just in general for iterating on a product is beta testing. So this is much cheaper, though also much less rigorous than clinical trials, but is a great way to get product validation and feedback from users. Unlike a clinical trial, it can be massively expanded to cover tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of users. While clinical trials, it's even hard to get hundreds. And with beta testing, it's much easier to try new variations of features, because in clinical trials, you're usually stuck to the features you specify when the scientific review board approves your treatment methods. So I'm going to talk quickly 3 parts about how to prepare for a clinical trial, because that's a very important aspect of any healthcare startup or any medical-based startup, and it's hard to get a nice outline of it. So this is the process that we found as we've been going through it, or as we went through it over the past couple months. So the first step, and this can be going on during the other steps as well, but is to draft a proposal. And in this proposal, which gets submitted to the scientific review board, you put forth your hypothesis and the purpose of your study. You discuss the procedure explicitly, and then you also talk about the safety precautions that you're taking, because it's very important you protect the safety of the participants. Then, or during drafting the proposal, you're looking for a clinician or a doctor or a researcher or a professor who has access to facilities that can accommodate a clinical trial. So you want to reach out to various doctors, and you want to find someone who's interested in your research, who's not just doing it for the money, but who actually is interested in it, because then they will be much more dedicated and help you out substantially more. The institution that they're at should have a scientific review board so that you can quickly get your application reviewed and approved. And then also you probably want to shop around a little, because as what we found is that costs can range quite a bit. Trials can start at $100,000 and they can move up to over $1 million. And these are numbers from the US. So here's a quick overview, like a kind of abstract outline from one of the studies I mentioned earlier. This is their method of their procedure, and this is basically just how they're going through their procedure. And you can look at the slides later. Got a couple more slides to get through, and we're getting close to the time. Won't leave time for questions for you guys. So how prepare for clinical trial part 2. The hardest part by far in a clinical trial is recruiting participants, because it's a 2-part challenge. Not only do you have to get people to sign up for your clinical trial, you have to get them to stay for your entire clinical trial. In the Levi study that I mentioned earlier, they had about 50% dropout rate, and they were a well-conducted trial, so it's very difficult. So this is all about marketing. You need to targeted Facebook ads, Google AdWords, advertisements at geographically close institutions, just lots of various things. In geographical location, you do have to keep in mind, unlike in beta testing, because a clinical trial requires in-person evaluation in order to be rigorous. So potentially the easiest part of a clinical trial is actually conducting it. So you've done all the hard work by getting the people and writing the procedure. Now you just execute the procedure and you make sure that good data is being taken. This is where the trial is actually expensive, because you have to pay for personnel to operate it. And then finally, you analyze the results. You have statisticians look at the result data, and they come up with things that are statistically significant. And then they work with whoever, which researcher was the head of the trial, and they will draft a report that you either can keep internal or publish for peer review, depending on where you are in your startup. So, and side note, some either good or bad news, depending on how you want to take it, is that usually the stats coming out of a clinical trial can be analyzed in a way as to support basically any conclusion that you want. So that's the interesting thing about statistics. So the fifth, and one of the most important things to keep in mind while working on any startup is analytics. So this is critical for both clinical trials and beta testing, because what analytics does is it provides you with data points on how your users actually using your application, not their perception of how they think they're using it, not your perception of how you think they're using it, not how your development team thinks the application is going to be used, but how it's actually being used. So what we're tracking at Luminopia, this is just a small subset of what we're tracking, but some of them are like how long the user is using the app for, at what times they're using it, which devices and which VR steps they are using the app with, how long it takes them to traverse throughout the application to make sure that they understand the VR environment, how much head motion they're doing, quite a few other things as well. Basically, you want to track every input that they do, because that allows you to analyze and then figure out how to make your application better. I'm going to briefly talk about how we are approaching analytics, running on a tight startup budget. So if you can find an existing analytics service that's cheap, go for it. Use it. We were collecting too much data to go with the cheaper solutions, so we decided to roll our own that we're running out of the AWS cloud for about $10 a month. So what we're doing is 2-part on the user's application. We send out events that when they occur, and we store them on the device so that they can be batch submitted later. We then have a pretty simple server. We're running Python Flask, but you can use, of course, basically anything, backed by a SQL database. And the server mostly acts as a CRUD interface for the database, so that the events just get logged in the database as seamlessly as possible. We then run analysis. We make a copy of the live database, and then we run analysis on that copy. And that allows us to perform intensive analysis without killing the live application. And because the system's modular in this regard, we're able to keep costs low. And also, if we need to, when we need to scale, we'll be able to scale up the various aspects independently and keep it quite cheap. So to conclude here, a couple wrap-up statements I wanted to provide you guys. First is that VR is getting a lot of attention right now for the gaming and video media usage, which is awesome because it's developing very intense VR applications that are unfathomable as of just a couple of years ago. But these applications of VR are just a small facet of the impact it can have on people's lives, particularly with medical treatment. So what is so cool about VR is how it entirely controls your environment in a way that allows it to be a wonderful method of promoting neuroplasticity because you can control their entire environmental stimulus. So neuroplasticity is an exciting psychological thing that's arisen in the past couple decades. It's the understanding that old dogs can learn new tricks, and with VR, you can make neuroplasticity education quite effective and quite fast. So what's the future of medical VR look like? These are just a couple small segment of what it can actually be applied to. But physical therapy augmentation is one. Physical therapy is usually a dual task. And as much as physical therapy is about physical, it's also about mental therapy in recovery. So VR can augment it in a way that makes it much more enjoyable and effective. Ocular disorders. I talked about amblyopia, but VR can be applied to a variety of ocular disorders, such as dyslexia and many more. Also, VR, because it controls a lot of your environmental stimulus, can help with things such as ADHD, PTSD, and depression, which are some debilitating mental health issues. And in a similar vein, VR can help with education, which is quite cool. So that concludes my talk. This is my email address. I would love to stay in touch to talk to you guys. You can reach out whenever you want. I'd love to answer any questions. And if you're interested in about how Luminopia is doing, you can find us at luminopia.org. And with that, I will switch to webcam mode, and I would love to take any questions you guys have. Okay, so let me make sure I'm starting at the top of the questions here. So apart from lazy eye, what other conditions have you seen that would benefit from VR treatment? So lazy eye is one of the easier ones because there has been quite a bit of research, or not quite a bit, but definitely some research showing how VR can be applied to it currently. But other types of things that VR can be applied to are other vision therapy disorders. So that includes dyslexia, which makes reading quite difficult, and it also includes other type of ocular disorders, such other myopias that cause blurring or other type of focus issues. So VR can be used to train that. Let's see here. Oh, yes, someone mentioned in the chat that phobias are another wonderful application of virtual reality. And that's also a very exciting application of I think, where virtual reality is moving towards. The current set of virtual reality is a little restricted and is not fully immersive as it ideally will be. But once it gets much more immersive, the treatment of phobias is definitely something that virtual reality can be applied to, which will be very exciting. So many people talk about VR causing eye strain. Which precautions do you take when treating eye disorders? So eye strain is definitely one difficulty that people can experience with virtual reality. What we're doing to approach it is, unfortunately, not enough research has been done to show how to effectively remove eye strain or at what point it's caused. What we found, though, is that people using in our beta testing group and in our clinical study group have been able to use our product for up to an hour without getting eye strain. So what we're doing to reduce eye strain is to keep the images from being too visually chaotic or too much movement or too bright, so that it represents a more muffled, I suppose, or more less intrusive visual stimulus than some VR experiences. And we found that that does reduce eye strain. Another question, do you go to any VR meetups in Boston? So I have not actually been to any large VR meetups in Boston. There's out of Harvard, they do have some other VR startups. So we do have internal meetups here. But I will definitely be looking into other VR meetups in Boston. And if you guys have any recommendations, please share them in the comments for myself and for other people in the comments. Okay, so if you guys, I'll leave a couple more minutes, I suppose, for if any other questions pop up. Sure, so what engine do we use? So we actually have had an evolution in our engine usage at Luminopia. We began with that web platform demo, which was basically a home-built engine, didn't require much. Following that, we were working with some raw Objective-C code and Coco's 2DX to build some more complex demos. But we are now, our current prototypes are based on the Unity engine. We found that Unity is doing a wonderful job creating an excellent development environment and integrating with SDKs extremely well. So I know one of the prior speakers was from Unity and didn't want to plug his own platform, but I will definitely give a plug to Unity. It's a wonderful setup. And then another question is, are you a part of an incubator at Harvard? Yes, Luminopia was running out of the VentureWorks incubator, and now we are running out of the Harvard Innovation Lab incubator for this spring semester, and we are looking to graduate from that for a larger incubator in the summer. Another question is, which headset do we use? So at Luminopia, we're trying to target basically all potential headsets. So we are developing on $5 Google Cardboards all the way up to Oculus Rifts, because we want to make sure that we accommodate the lowest end and a very cost-effective end. We are mostly working on the Google Cardboard style headsets, and our preference currently for development and our recommendations to users for that is the Mattel headset. I will see if I have a quick link on here that I can post in the chat later. Another question is, how did your collaboration with Boston Children's Hospital start? So one of our things, our startup, is we knew we needed to get a good board of advisors as quickly as possible. And we fortunately just closed our recruitment round. We're now up to 8 that we're quite happy with. So our first advisor was actually from the Boston Children's Hospital. And so after developing our first MVP prototype, the web technologies one, we reached out to various ophthalmologists in the industry, and we were quite focused on several at Boston Children's Hospital because of their leading national setup. So it involved quite a few emails and quite a bit of phone calls and quite a bit of meetings that took place over a month or two. But it was mostly demonstrating our application and our vision. But it was getting our foot in the door, was reaching out to as many people as possible. Another question is, I saw that you mentioned 3.js on your slides. Have you moved on to Unity, or are you using it in conjunction with Unity? So I mentioned 3.js because if you're building a minimum viable product for VR, you don't need to feel like you have to fully understand Unity or you have to dive into those SDKs. If you want to use a simple JavaScript style engine or development, it's definitely, there's potential for it. So our earliest prototype, we did end up using, we did not use 3.js in that prototype. We used it in a secondary prototype. But yeah, we did use 3.js for a little bit in order to get something that was as cross-platform as possible so that we could send it to basically anyone. And if they had a web browser, they were able to run the demo and see how it worked. We are now using Unity, though, because for an actual consumer product, Unity provides quite a nice development experience and allows us to develop quite a complex, seamless, and polished application. I'll wait a minute or two more to see if there are any other questions that come in. In the interim, I will post a link to our favorite headset. Sure, so someone was asking about contact info here. So I have contact info on the slides that will be sent out later, but I will also post my email, and I'll post our Twitter handle for Luminopia in the chat. You can find us at those locations. And let me quickly pop up. So one of the questions was, would you see any reason to go back to using Three.js? We currently we believe we're at a stage where it no longer makes sense for us to use Three.js, mostly because Three.js does have some limitations when it comes to VR. As good as the web platform is, with the gyroscope manipulation, it's not as good as native, and it's hard to get FPS that's as performant as a native application. So we have definitely moved past Three.js, but it is, for building minimum viable products, I still think it's quite useful. Another question, I have a VR and gaming, oh, not a question, comment, my bad. Are there examples of 3D input in medical applications such as Connect or Leap? So the exciting thing about the medical field in VR is that there's definitely a lot of overlap going on right now. You can find quite a bit coming out of UC Berkeley, I believe. So I am not intimately aware of any 3D input methods going on, mostly because we don't find much of a need or use for them in our treatment space. But I believe I have read some news reports of 3D input in medical applications, particularly being used for autonomous, like seeing iDog style setups. For blind people, they'll be using Connects to do 3D input and then providing auditory responses based off of that. Outside of that, I'm not directly aware. Sorry. I'm posting a link to our favorite low-cost headset that we use at Luminopia for development and that we recommend to our consumers. Okay, I will wait another minute or two and then let's see. How do researchers find programmers and artists for their app? So that is definitely a difficulty, quite a large difficulty actually. So in our case, I can't speak directly to this because in our case, two of our founding members have quite a bit of development experience. While our third founding member was the research person on our team. It's mostly coincidence that we met each other, though we were kind of reaching out. The developers were looking to do VR and the researcher was looking to treat amblyopia. So it did work out. Mostly though, I think how to find it can be hard to find good programmers. So one advantage is if you look at college students, they're usually, if you're a researcher, college students are usually very excited to jump into the research space. So you could probably definitely find programmers through that. Artists is a bit of a different matter. We've had we initially struggled with that as well too. So what we eventually look towards is contacting artists that we found online directly, either through websites like Dribbble or other artist showcase sites, which we found to be quite effective for finding good artists. Okay, well, thank you very much, guys. It was wonderful providing this talk for you guys, and I hope you guys got something out of it. Please feel free to hit me up at my email or at our Luminopia Twitter. And I'm very excited to see what the VR industry has coming out of it over the next couple of years. Have a great day.